put up, we have a very brief introduction here, a little PowerPoint thing to get us started. We're going to go over some of the rules, some of the ideas, main ideas here. So just to get us started, we'd like everybody to participate in some way. And this is the easiest way to begin with, is just write in the chat box where you live. And I know some people said that they didn't get the book until the last moment, and just say yes or no, or put a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you were able to finish the book. Jess writes that she didn't get the book read. Most of the book from Christine. Yeah. Okay. Cornelia didn't get it finished. Cornelia, I believe you're the person who knew the author in person.
Yes. Jan, Flora, and I were on her committee for her graduate study, and we've actually had a visit with her the last time she came through Ames, which was, when was that, Jen? In the fall.
Okay. All right.
So we love the book.
All right. All right. So next, and everybody's had a chance to enter something there.
Did you enter, Jen?
I haven't got through it yet. Yep. Okay. Well, I think there might be questions that you guys can ponder even if you haven't read it all. So I hope that you can participate. Again, these are our hosts, Sierra Club, the Iowa chapter, and I'm Kathy Getty, and I'm one of the board members. I serve on the legislative committee, and Jess Mazur, whom you probably all know. And then the next slide, just a few ideas to keep in mind. This came from Co-Creative Labs, and that is that we ask that you can remain on camera at all times. We aren't going to have any breaks. You remain available to be on bike. We hope, you know, that we want to break down the noise if you're tapping your pencil or something, but just, yeah, try to keep on task. Feel free to raise your hand if you want to make a comment. You can either do it like this or by putting up your icon hand raised. So hello, Peter, welcome. And then I've tried this before. Sometimes we don't know when people stop talking. And so when you're done with your talk, or because part of this will be writing, but part of this will be conversation. Sometimes I've asked people to say, I'm complete whenever you're done speaking. However, people don't always do that. So, and then I also want you to be mindful of your airtime. We're calling this a book discussion. So, you know, even though you have lots of information or you're really excited about the topic, we want you to be mindful of how much you're talking and if you're allowing other people to contribute as well. And then if you aren't talking, you know, I may call upon you at times to get your thoughts, although again, it is an invitation and not an obligation. And if you're one of those people who fidgets, you know, maybe find something to manipulate with your fingers, or a task to do with your fingers to keep from doing other tasks as you participate in this. And then finally, just have grace with yourself and others. We're all figuring this out together. I probably by now you're all practice Zoom participants, but you know, I just want you to, you know, don't worry too much about what's going on or how you present yourself. And just take a moment to think about what is one thing that you want to be mindful for yourself today? What is it, how you want to show up? And, you know, you don't have to share it with us, but just kind of think about that. Like, I would want to be welcoming and generous, in my kind, in my communications with you. So just take a moment to think about that, and then we'll just go directly to our questions. Okay, so I think we'll start simply with, before we go with the voice thing for the verbal conversation, just type in one word or phrase, or a phrase that stuck out when you were reading the book. Even if you only read the first page or something like that, what was an idea that stuck with you? And put that in the chat box. So okay. See, Jess and I have, I'm hoping other people can see their chat box at this point. Biomimicry. Okay. All right. So now let's just go into some of that verbal discussion then. So if you have, so let's just think about what new insights about forests did you gain from this book? Am I going to call on a name? Is that how you want me to proceed, guys? How about somebody who's finished the book? Cornelia? Can you unmute yourself and share with an insight that you think you got from this?
Well, that all forests need not be large, and they certainly should not be monocultured.
Okay. Does somebody else have an important idea from this?
Got one. I think that I agree with the statements in the book where it's hard to get past what we've always been told, is that when you plant trees, they need lots of space between them. So
Okay.
it was interesting for me to hear that that's not the case in this method.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was going to share about how close you can plant things. And I thought it was interesting how quickly things were growing. That was really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Was
I
it
think
like
we
30
should
times?
remember about who was telling us space trees. It's when you're growing trees to harvest. And that's when you want them spaced out so you can and the loggers in there. So we're taught sort of the industrial forest, where we should be learning the real forest. I took a forestry class at UC Berkeley, 60 years ago. And it was very interesting to see the different ways of looking at it.
Okay. So that makes me think of Peter, you wanted to say something? Whoops, Peter, you muted.
Well, yes, I did, only because I wanted to sort of share an experience I had as a college student. I was itinerant over the summers. I'd often travel, hitchhike. And one year, I'll spare the long story, but I ended up working for a farmer because his parents met me and thought I needed a job, which I didn't, but I didn't know how to say no. And one of the jobs, I had a sort of an interesting position with him because we talked quite a bit. He owned thousands of acres in northern Wisconsin. And so the job that he took me to do was managing a crew cutting pulpwoods out in the woods. And I found it sort of detestable as an environmentalist. I thought, oh my God, I don't think I like this, because, we're ripping trees down and they're all falling all over each other. And we're skidding them out. And so at the end of a couple of days of working in the woods and what I thought of as sort of destroying forest, I shared that with him. And he was a very intuitively intelligent guy. Even though he wasn't highly educated, he wasn't uneducated. And so he took me to plots of land throughout all the acres he had and showed me the various stages of harvest and regrowth. And I gained a whole new respect for what he was doing in terms of managing forest land in a way that was sustainable. Because he wasn't just clearing out lands of all the wood. He basically had portions of his woodlands in different stages of growth. And it wasn't widely spaced and it wasn't seeded. It was pretty chaotic and crazy. But those pulpwoods in northern Wisconsin grow rather fast in rather chaotic situations. So it just led me to understand that there were many ways to look at the garden and managing and tending the garden. And so this book gave me an insight that I could possibly, on the lands I'm looking at purchasing in the Northwoods, have an impact maybe smaller in scale than what he was managing, but at least have an impact. That there's a way for somebody with 50 or 100 acres to actually make a difference.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We're talking about that. So instead of, I'm going to jump to the questions about logging and about the tree forever young part of the book. And they talked about tree plantations at that point. And I guess, what do you recall as the author's reasons for not planting trees in monocultures? Or tree plantation is how I would describe that. Did anybody get to that part besides me? I know some of you hadn't finished all of the book, and that was nearer the end. Is that a question not worth answering?
Well, yeah. Well, no, not that it's not worth answering, but it's the lack of biodiversity in a monoculture. That's the main point, I think.
Okay, biodiversity. And then when I was rereading the book, I also, if you're concerned about climate change, there's a conservation part, but you're concerned about climate change. There is the concept that for for 100 centimeter tree diameter tree, it has 3 times the carbon structure than a tree that has half of its diameter. So for every, I missed that the first time. The second time I was reading it, go, oh, wow. And so, yeah, it's the biodiversity and it's also the climate change. So I'm sorry, I'm talking too much when I was supposed to be the facilitator. So, all right. Let's go back to just Miyawaki Forest. That's how I say it. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing it correctly. Maybe somebody else has a better way of saying it, absolute certain way. But what personal reaction did you have to this book? What feeling would you associate with reading this book? How about Debbie? Did you get through it, Debbie?
No, I'm glad to hear that trees can be planted closer together, and that when I read the description of the event, I've read research that shows if you have trees along a stream bank and there's shadows, you can measure the amount of shadows that are in the water. That improves water quality. So that's another aspect of trees that makes them wonderful, I'm glad that this guy's come up with this concept.
Okay. Any other input? Did anybody not like what they read? Did anybody have a negative reaction to the book?
I haven't had the opportunity to fact check this, but I was on a global climate conference with people talking about reforestation in places like the Amazon, and they talked about the fact that the first 20 years, let's say on the average, the carbon effect is negative. And so that the 20 to 30 year solution is still a burden in terms of carbon, and we need to severely limit consumption in conjunction with rebuilding that carbon potential, because it's not immediate. I mean, you got 20 years of this process being a drain on our carbon bank before it begins to contribute. And so that was an interesting concept I intended to flesh out more as I got finished with the book.
I wonder if that's same as if that applies to the Miyawaki method, because they say that a forest using the Miyawaki method grows 30 times faster than the natural succession of trees, so a forest. So, but it could, yeah. So Lewis, the author, writes that weeds she describes weeds as a scab, something that is beneficial in getting to the next stage of healing. If people began to take that viewpoint, how would that change our neighborhoods? If you think about our lawns and the, herbicides that we put in there to get rid of the weeds, if we change that, if that was how would anybody want to take Jan, you want to take a stab at that question? I don't think I've called on you. Ever heard from you?
Could you repeat the question?
Well, I think you should know we don't have a monoculture in our front yard. We really like biodiversity, and we don't use any chemicals on it. And we get this wonderful mixture of clovers and a whole variety of grasses and other forbs. I mean, it's really very nice and not a monoculture. And
Okay.
I was struck by, I grew up in Western Kansas, so we didn't have very many forests. And I was struck by the fact that the rules for forest growth are rather similar for cultivated crops if you're going to grow them in a ecologically sound way as well. And the importance of having good soil, and if it's not good, building the soil. I always thought that trees sort of grew wherever you put them, and you didn't need to worry about the quality of the soil as much as you did when you were planting crops. But that I don't think that's true.
Right. Great comparison there. Yeah. Okay. So you kind of led, so how would that apply to our agricultural practices here in Iowa if farmers didn't, think of weeds as the enemy? Or are we, I don't know if that's a fair question or not.
well, how do we define a weed? It's a plant we don't want where it's currently located. That's the only way we define it as a weed. So it is a social, not a biological
Construct.
definition.
Okay. All right. Lewis also shared that not all biomes are predisposed, should be made into forests, and generally not replaced by the forest, a Miyawaki method or otherwise. Where in Iowa do you think it would be appropriate to put in a Miyawaki forest? Eric, we haven't heard from you yet. Got any thoughts on that? Jessica, can you unmute him?
You want me to unmute myself or you want me?
No, I got
Unmute.
it.
I got it? Okay,
Somewhere where we have space. Mm,
all right.
and some willing parties, I guess.
So it
There's
could be on
something-
private land as well as public land?
Yeah.
Okay. What parts of Iowa, what parts of Iowa were naturally forest areas? Where do we find our forests today?
Oh, I don't know. There are some on the east side, right? Before we get to Illinois.
By the rivers.
Yeah,
Okay,
that could be one.
yeah, okay. I think the DNR in Iowa actually had some plans to put Iowa savannas, oak savannas, I'm sorry, in along some of the river banks.
Yeah.
Was
But
that
an oak
Tom?
savanna, an oak savanna is a widely spaced trees. They're not densely populated. And the stuff along the riverbanks, if I remember right, are basically like cottonwoods and willows, the stuff that come up fast and then burn down as fire burns down to the edges of the stream. So I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the name, Milwaukee.
I think it's
Probably
Milwaukee.
wouldn't be appropriate for a lot of Iowa.
Okay,
Now for the
Right.
eastern deciduous forest, yeah.
okay. Yeah,
Well, I mean, it would be wise, I mean, because of the cost of the Milwaukee method, to look at dense urban areas to try and complement some of them, and then they've had marketing schemes. But we're looking at Iowa originally, I believe, had somewhere between, was about 18% forested, which would be mostly along the riverways. And today at best, we're 6 or 7% forested. So, I mean, if you ask for the best places to utilize the method, other than creating some great buffers in urban areas to help offset urbanization and the issues there, probably looking at the areas that were previously forested and looking at methodologies to, you'd have to get land back from agriculture, and that's, that would be expensive proposition.
okay.
I was thinking some really good areas would be near schools. Because I was struck by what they said. Someone, and maybe it was Milwaukee, said that you want to get children under the age of 12 involved in the forest so that they can see what that feels, have that experience. And it saddens me to think of all the children that grow up with screens and aren't running around in the woods. They're not having that connection that I grew up with.
Okay. Steve, I'm glad we can see you now. Or maybe the screen is just shifting and you were there always, but
No, I just got it clicked on here.
okay. I'm not sure how to say this gentleman's name, but the Shibhendu Sharma, the guy who volunteered to help Milwaukee when when Milwaukee planted mini forests, a Milwaukee method at the Toyota plant. And then he grew up and he thought that he later went on to establish a forest. And he said in the interview with the author that the Milwaukee was something that everybody should know. So who are the groups, the professions, the types of people who should be knowing about the Milwaukee method? Who do you think, besides the people in this discussion group who've read this book, who besides us should know about the Milwaukee method?
I'd say city park and recreation programs.
Okay,
Or just cities in general, because they'd be able to control the availability for creating a forest.
all right. Any other ideas? Steve?
Well, educators certainly, but you'd have to teach teachers I mean, because I think the discussion about forest land and carbon capture through forests and any method, including Miyawaki, would be a great thing to expose young children to,
Okay.
so that they grow up feeling that there's a positive methodology to be able to rebuild the earth in a healthy way.
Okay. Jess writes in the chat box, all the people who live in the cookie cutter neighborhoods with no trees. Steve, was your eye out? You raised your hand. Did somebody take your idea?
Well, I just wanted to add on to a couple of ideas that I've heard there already. I agree that it's very important to have tree areas where children can reach them on a daily basis. So close to schools is a good idea. And I also wanted to add on that the notion that trees should be planted close together, or that they can be planted close together, is really, really important. We live in a what I call the neat and tidy syndrome culture of conquering nature. And we think we have to plant trees in parks 40 to 60 feet apart. So I think every public park should have a portion of it, a good portion, planted in a wilder fashion where trees overlap and where things can become more natural and children can explore and become surprised. And that's one of the critical things about human relationship to nature.
Okay. You make me think about this question that I had, that the author shares the French philosopher's view that as humans, we see ourselves as separate from nature. Either we think we are to exploit it or to protect it. There's two opposing camps. And this gentleman urges that we see ourselves as part of that ecosystem, and that we can take and give back in a balanced way. So how here in Iowa, how do you see that being played out? That push-pull sort of thing, that those are two opposing parties.
Probably even before we looked at it in terms of opposition between peoples and cultures, I mean, I think humankind has evolved very much like a parasite, and but we're not even well ordained in terms of how a parasitical relationship, which is not necessarily unhealthy. We're very viral compared to nature. Our ability to change nature is not unlike the way a virus affects a human being. Our contribution to changes, even arguably, whether we're the cause of many extinctions or if the rise in extinctions is just a naturally occurring set of events. But I mean, we also have to reframe humans' relationship with the earth. And I mean, I think a few acres of forest doesn't just do that justice. I mean, I think it's a great idea, but I think it needs to be part of a holistic teaching that we may want to call ourselves stewards, and we may want to think we're all powerful, but in terms of geologic time, humans may just as well be extinct in short order, simply because we haven't played well with nature, and things like reforestation are at least a step in the right direction.
Okay. Peter made an analogy there, calling out, sort of, whereas viruses, or a parasite on our host. Somebody have other images that they could think of us as human beings and how we're impacting our ecosystems at this time? Image? Oops, anybody want to take a stab at that?
This is Jan.
Okay.
A few years ago, we visited the Menominee in Wisconsin, and they have an entire county. The county is coterminous with the reservation. And they grow, they have forests. And my guess is that their forests probably have a lot in common with the Milwaukee approach. I think they're denser. I've heard that the astronauts, when they travel around the Earth, could locate the county, Menominee County, because the forest ended right at the border. When you got into the traditional agricultural area outside their reservation or their county, there weren't very many forests to speak of, very many trees. And there were certainly, if there were trees, they were much more spread out. And so they practiced, they had a rather sophisticated way of determining when they were going to harvest, because they saw the forest as playing a commercial role, but they harvested very carefully and obviously did not do clear cutting. And so I think, again, many of the practices of Native Americans are ones that are much more ecological than our settler society has developed. And my guess is that they would either really like the Milwaukee approach, or they'd say, oh, well, we're already doing it anyhow.
Okay. All right. I once told my son, when talking about images, I told my son, just think of us as rats inhabiting a house. We have so many of us, and we're doing it, and eventually this house is going to collapse and there won't be anything left, and we'll all have to, be without. And he says, Mom, that's too harsh. Don't repeat that. So I don't know. So I haven't till today. All right. So see, we talked a lot about biodiversity here just in the last few minutes, and like our culture, we tend to say, people as a whole, most of us say, I live on the earth rather than I live with the earth. And can anybody else think of examples of how that's being played out, about, how this vision of us as consumers, or as, this endless supplier of resources? Can you think of other examples in our culture where that's happening?
We're using up water in the West. We're depleting our aquifers. We're mining to the point of extraction, to the point of spoiling the land completely. There's lots of examples of how dominant human beings are on this earth.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I just wanted to say that I'm a practicing Christian, but I do not like the creation story in Genesis. I much prefer some of the Native American indigenous peoples' creation stories, which have a coming together, a cooperative kind of creation, rather than something coming in that you will have dominion over it. And I think that notion of dominion has been a very evil concept and done humankind very little good, frankly.
Steve, you wanted to say something? Whoops, you're muted.
It just reminded me of an email conversation I read a few months ago. A woman was commenting about some animal species that were likely to go extinct that you might not expect. And she was pointing out the seal problem in the Pacific Northwest, that seals are considered competitors for fishermen and hunters. And so they're frequently shot and poisoned and that sort of thing. And they call them on the Columbia River at the dams, or at least they're proposing to do that. And so some gentleman challenged her about that and argued that this was a necessary situation. And they went back and forth several times. And finally, she said she was really exasperated, I think. And she finally said, well, I've given you all the technical reasons why my statement should be taken seriously, but you're a dominionist, and there's nothing else I can say to you. So everything was practical in his mind.
Yeah. Right. So did anybody get to the part where they talked about the mini forest guide, about the 5 steps for implementing a mini forest? No. Okay, then we won't go to that part of the questions, but there are 5 steps. And how about the part where the author talked about tree fervor, and where the planting of trees is an easy way to our problems of solving the climate crisis? And she thought that might be a negative influence on our society, that this is just something that you know, have you any thoughts about why just planting trees as a solution, the best and only, you know, the most easiest solution? You know, this was something that was brought about by the media, where it's, oh, this tree solution, you just plant some trees and everybody, you know, in the earth, plant a tree, and then our problems with climate change will be over. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's our usual tech fix way of thinking. We don't think in systems. We think in terms of A leads to B. We don't think about the whole ecosystem and how that all works together. So I'm not sure. I think I think we should stop cutting down trees, and we should plant more trees. But for a whole variety of reasons, I think for the sake of our children, not just to absorb carbon, but because of what trees can teach us. And being with trees and the questions trees cause us to ask.
Okay. I will confess that I just had an ash tree cut down this past month, and it really hurt. And I think it was the mother tree in my area, because I was planting some flowers, and there I got into the not the rhizome, what is that? What's the mycorrhizal fungi that connects the trees with all the other growing things? And it was real startling at first to see, oh, what is this? And then wheels start turning. But why am I telling you that story? I was going to lead into a question, and now it is gone. So the author talked about the healing of forests. What would be a good reason just to dedicate a chapter of the book towards the healing power of forests? Val, we haven't heard or seen from you yet. Did you get a chance to read the book? I see you joined us later.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was Actually, I was on a hike. I got back late. So, yeah, I did have a chance to read it a while ago, and I kind of, tried to review parts of it. I don't totally know what the direction of your discussion is. I think, as I read it, it seems like such a wonderful creative approach to changing our environment or having impact on our environment. But I kept wondering how feasible something like the Miyawaki method is, just generally. I mean, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of people, and how that might be applicable to how we might be able to apply it in Iowa. But that's like totally not what you're talking about.
Okay.
But that is what, my initial response was, how the Miyawaki approach. It's so creative, and it seems like, places like the Netherlands and India and some of these other places have done amazing things with it, or France, I guess. So I was curious if people thought it was feasible and what it could possibly look like in Iowa. But anyway.
We did have that question. We did talk
Okay.
about that earlier, Val, and
Thanks, thank you.
and to make it short, we thought maybe in parks where there could be wild parts, and then the part where the trees are 60 feet apart, but also a part of that, and maybe around eastern Iowa where the forests are, or maybe around riverbeds. So, but Valerie makes me think of another thought, that was that the author did provide a lot of different examples of how different communities, different individuals implemented the Miyawaki method in their, in France, in Iran, in the dry parts of Cameroon, was it Cameroon or somewhere, just all across the world, to Japan, of course. And why do you think the author might have structured her book with all those different examples? What's the benefit to the author by doing something like that? The author's mission. Anybody, even if you haven't read a book, what's the good of having multiple examples of how something is accomplished when you're trying to promote that idea?
I think the obvious answer is that it's adaptable to many different types of situations. And I think that's particularly important as we think about global warming, because I think in many different situations, having dense trees is going to have a salutary effect on reduction of global warming. And I was thinking about the derecho, which came through, I guess it's been now, what, a year and a half ago, or maybe 2.5 years ago. The one that happened in the summer.
Yeah.
And so we're working on climate issues in Ames. The city has a climate action plan. And so I thought, well, what we could do would be to just go back and replant the trees that were lost. And that would have a salutary effect. But it turned out, in terms of the trees that were lost by the city, that is, the trees that were between the sidewalk and the curb, and the ones that were in the parks as well, there were only like 430 that were lost. And on a few weekends, a group of people went and planted back the trees. So, but the question for me now is, what if we'd thought about a different approach where the trees were planted much more densely, and it, you know, it could, as global warming continues, we know that trees have a cooling effect. And so we could have rather than having lots of concrete that absorbs all of that heat,
Yeah.
we would have trees that were cooling the atmosphere.
I was making me think about the woman who was, what was her name? In Africa, on the in Cameroon, and the continent of Africa. Her main emphasis was to educate girls and give them a living so that they could move, you know. But then she used mini forest as coming at that problem as part of the solution to that problem. And then also it also became loss of water, and you know, and that's how it, you know, that the idea that finally pushed this thing forward. And I guess because I have such a terrible memory for details, I decided to go through and make a chart of how, you know, the different countries, the different people, who they involved, and what the problem was, and how they involved. And I just was struck by how sometimes coming at a problem sideways is, you know, what are the benefits of coming at a problem instead of directly coming in at it sideways? Sorry. Somebody want to take a stab at that? Steve, you look like you're ready to come up with something.
Well, I don't know, you know, if this is of any help or not, but I like to point out to people that individual trees that are planted as specimen trees, no matter how much you might like trees, especially when they're in rows, they get kind of boring after a while. And the human condition has given us this wonderful opportunity to have a memory of the things that surprise us. And so when you're moving through the landscape, whether it's a dense forest that's kind of all the same, or an individual tree, if it doesn't have some special character to it, it's just another tree. And so one of the things that we should be thinking about doing is creating systems of movement through the landscape so that we see those special trees, or the relationship between the tree and the topography, or the ground, or the soil, or how the moisture seeps out through the soil. And as just your average person travels through the landscape, they start to notice these differences, and they ask questions, you know, like, why is that tree so crooked? And why are these particular trees growing so close together? Like when I drive down the highway, my attention is always focused on the clump of oak trees, or the oak trees that have the long horizontal branches that are 8 or 10 feet off the ground. And when I explain to people that those are fire regime trees and that they're pre-settlement trees, it awakens people to a whole different way of relating to the landscape. So to me, the matter isn't so much planting trees or numbers of trees, but it's where you plant them, or how you preserve them if they're old trees, and why you preserve them. And so it's a little bit more of a theme of a human response to nature that is the important thing about trees. And the same thing could be said about rocks and streams and a lot of other things. So, for example, if you have a forest, whether it's wild or in rows, one of the most important things to introduce to the visitor is to give the visitor a sense of gateway or entry into that forest. And you can do that in a number of different ways, but it's thinking about the finesse between the landscape and the person that makes the difference. And so if you do that and you're a little bit successful with it, I think it means more to almost everyone, as opposed to just thinking about whether it's a row of trees or a dense forest. So I don't know if that helps or not, but that's my view.
Okay. You know, if you think about the Sierra Club, and, you know, we might be considered one of those people who say it's time to protect, you know, we're the people who is protect the trees. What are the implications of that statement about whether, you know, instead of having two opposing camps, changing that mindset that we should all be, we're all part of nature and we're interdependent on every living thing? What implications are there that Jess and Pam should know or consider, board members should be considering when it comes time to changing that mindset? What are focuses that, what advice do you have after reading this book?
I think several people have mentioned this, but it is a relational thing. It is not just the trees are there, but it's our relation to them and how that helps us relate to each other and the soil and the water and how they're all tied together. So again, it is a way to bring people into a systems way of thinking and an appreciation of things we once took for granted or were annoyed by, and we begin to see why it's important.
Any other thoughts? I know, I think I recall, know for certain, and we maybe applied again to, for funding to increase wildlife pathways, encouraging biodiversity across the state. How does that relate to this book?
No, that was what, this is Val. One of the first things I thought about, if we were looking at wildlife corridors, that it would be great if we could implement some of the Miyawaki method ideas to the wildlife corridors project. And maybe this is what was meant by what was mentioned before, but my understanding is that the community is involved in the planting, and that makes a huge difference when people are that in terms of connecting with the community and how they relate to it. So I just and I also wonder that in Iowa it might not be so much trees, but like if it was an oak savanna, it would be, you know, the bur oaks and prairie. I mean, not necessarily, we use the term forest for Miyawaki, but it might not necessarily be a forest, because he really emphasizes using native species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, exactly. Okay. This might be a time in which people can be talking about, well, let me preface this one here by Miyawaki and Box, the two gentlemen who first started promoting planting the healing power of trees, that people want to be happy. And communal tree planting is a way of revitalizing communal land. It allows for hope and allows each of us to take responsibility. Nothing Miyawaki is quoted as saying, "Nothing is greater than living. Then what is the reason for living? It is to do something anyone can do anywhere for our tomorrow." He chose to plant trees. So what is something that anyone can do for our tomorrow here in Iowa? You know, I'll give an everyday example. Buying toilet paper made out of recycled paper rather than Charmin or those toilet paper products that are come from tearing down virgin forests in Canada. So, any other ideas? Like, I'm going to take a graphic of the AB, grade report of the companies. I'm going to take it to my grocer and say, let's see more of these A+ brands on the shelves. So, other ideas anybody can do.
Well, personally, over the years, I've had to cut down about 5 trees out of my backyard. So now it's becoming prairie. The lawn's being torn up and it's going to prairie or wildflower plots. Not really prairie, but.
Get it. And Cornelia and John, it sounds like you've already done that as well. Any other ideas? Any advice for, we've kind of covered this question, but it is 8 o'clock and it is time. For those of you who have been going, when is this ever going to be over? But if you want to stay and talk, we can do that. I'll hang out, but if anybody wants to leave, no problem. So you can just
go. But I want to say that the notion of communal tree planting is really important. And if you can organize a church group or the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or whomever to do this together, or a school class to plant trees together and to think about it and talk about it, that probably is even more effective than us doing it on our own land. So I think that's one of the things we might think about organizing.
Okay.
I think
Steve?
every person that has a school that has a little bit of ground adjacent to it could use that as a rallying point to fulfill some of these ideas. We happen to have a new intermediate school here in Burlington named after Aldo Leopold. And so we took that opportunity to plant prairie, savanna, woodland area, about 2 acres right in front of the school on terrible soil that was formerly a housing project. And we got some money from DNR for school tree plantings. And, we just mined all the sources that we could. And so we have a prairie that has about 80 species growing in it now. It's about 10 years old. Has a rock outcrop and an area where students can gather for classes and a pathway system that runs through it. And I know a lot of schools don't have an acre of ground, but if you do have any schools that have any extra ground, for whatever reason they have it, you never know. But if they do, then that's probably one of the first places that you should go to try to stimulate some activities. The second choice for me would be to take any stream corridor that you have in your communities and try to approach the landowners with extending the buffer strips and planting zones along those streams, not just to grasses and prairie, but to forests also.
The deeper the roots, the more it holds the soil.
And then if you could be bold enough to take it one step further, to try to have a trail system go along that stream corridor. So it would require an easement from the owner, but when people can get out and travel through that landscape, it creates goodwill between the private landowners, particularly if they're farmers, and the community. So to be able to get the people from the community out into the agricultural lands, into the working landscapes, is a really important motive for planting more trees, or vice versa. So lots of ways we can do it, I think.
What about drainage ditches? Is that a possibility? You know, where they, in the farmland? A lot of it is grassland. Is that,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, if you have some large bottomland terraces that have been tiled and have drainage ditches in them, I live along the Mississippi River, so we see a lot of that. We have a floodplain in Illinois that's about 10 miles wide, 8 miles wide. And the strange thing about it is that these tile lines and these drainage ditches frequently don't completely drain the area. So you'll have these rather large areas, perhaps an acre or more, that's kind of a wet area that they try to farm it, but they never get anything out of it. You've got water in the ditch right next to it. It seems to me that if you could just pump a little bit of that water back up on top of the dam, you'd have a ready-made wetland that could have a tree border around it. And the farmer doesn't get much out of it anyway. So if we could have systems that would follow these drainage ditches and hook together a small pathway that would connect each of these little wet spots that are not very productive, you could actually save farmers money.
Steve, those all sound like great ideas, and I love that you worked on the school. I was curious, did you totally replace the soil then with organic matter, or not?
No, that was kind of a big debate. We had a clay soil has, gravel and concrete and asphalt. It's just really terrible soil. And, we didn't, it was a big project. We didn't have really money to start from the ground up and to take a lot of time to culture that soil before we started the prairie. So we just went with what we had. And I know that some people advise against that, but we felt like we needed a quick turnaround. Prairie has so many distractors who say that it takes so long and it's so much work and, it's so expensive and, whatever negative things they can come up with, they'll throw at you. So to counteract that, we went in quickly. We did put some topsoil in. And we not only seeded it, but we also spent a lot of money on plugs. So our second and third year of the prairie were just butterfly heavens. We had, everybody just loving it and thinking it was so successful. Now, after over 10 years, we've had a reduction in the prairie plants, and it's time to go back in and put some more forbs back in. But, our goal was to kind of work again.
Am I the only one who's having trouble hearing Steve?
I can't hear, no.
Steve, something's happened to your connection. You've frozen.
Thought,
Steve,
no.
we lost you there for a while.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just saying that if anybody's interested in that school prairie project, we have a brochure that we could send you electronically if you send me an email.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Anything else people want to say? Should we end? Or does somebody else have some? Okay, so then I think we will then end this meeting. I want to thank, not this meeting, this book discussion. thank you all for joining us tonight. I think we had good participation, a good size. Sometimes you never know. And thank you for showing up. Woo. Pleasure, pleasure.
Thank you for hosting.
Well,
Thank you, Kathy.
you're welcome. You're welcome. I like book talks. I like books. So I'll see you around, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk with you